Right, well, thank you everyone for coming, thank you for having me. It was a really interesting morning as well, hearing about all of the different things people are working on. And I'm going to follow on from Jeremy's theme here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about research methods as opposed to teaching, so I hope that proves useful. So my name's Adam Crymble. I'm a historian by training. I don't know if there's any other historians in the room. I know we've got people from all sorts of different backgrounds here. And my research area is studying migrant experience, particularly in the 18th century, with a particular focus on migrant experience in Britain. And what I'm trying to figure out is what was it like to be a migrant in British society, and what was the relationship between the host community and those newcomers. And I've done this in lots of different ways and looked at lots of different groups. So I've looked at Irish migrants, I've looked at black communities, I'm currently looking at German immigrants, and I've done some work on internal migration within England as well. Now, as some of you may know, working with historical materials means you have to be adaptable in your methodologies because the surviving evidence is often quite patchy. So you might have some quantitative materials which, for example, will give you some information about the size of a migrant group in a particular time and place, but you might be missing a month of information or a decade of information about that group that you would like to have. You might have qualitative evidence, such as a letter somebody wrote, but you might not have its reply. So you've got to be creative when you're trying to build up a case for what you can understand about these people and their experiences. And in my experience, doing this has led me to go in a lot of different methodological directions over the years, and look at lots of different disciplines for the ways that they would deal with problems like the ones that I'm facing. And I've come to kind of realize that no matter what my research problem is, somebody somewhere in some discipline is working on a similar problem, probably with a different set of materials, focused on a different type of community in a different time and place. And they're probably not even aware that we've got this shared methodological interest. So I've gone looking for methodological solutions in fields such as geography, linguistics, demography, nutrition, law, even archival sciences, and I spend a lot of time either collaborating with people in those fields or with teaching myself the methods so that I can actually apply it to my own research. And this has been a great system for me, so if you're having methodological challenges, I'd encourage you to see what people are doing in other disciplines, which is, I know, what we're all doing today. And this has been so useful to me, actually, that I've spent quite a lot of time in the past decade helping other humanities scholars and historians to do the same thing. And I've been involved for a number of years now with a project called the Programming Historian, and that's what I wanted to share a little bit with you today. Now, this is a project that started as a blog back in Canada in 2008, and this is on the screen here is the actual blog post announcing this. And it was launched by a historian named William J Turkell. Now, Turkell had a background in both history and computer science, and he was one of the early interdisciplinary scholars in history who really saw the potential of the internet as a huge archive of material, which is just waiting to be data mined. So while his colleagues were off in the library or in the archive reading bits of paper, Turkell was doing something quite unique with his students, which wasn't really anywhere else in the history curriculum at the time. And that was he was teaching them to write code. So he taught them, in particular, how to write Python code scripts, which could automatically download content from the internet, clean it up, remove all the unwanted formatting from it, and then conduct some simple linguistic analyses on that text. He had a great saying, which was that if you don't learn to code, your research will always be at the mercy of those who can. Or to put it another way, if you don't know how to build research tools, then you're stuck using out-of-the-box solutions. And in our case in history, it was really rare that those out-of-the-box solutions were created by or for members of our community. So his idea was to teach humanities students how to do this for themselves. And that was really unusual at the time. There really wasn't anything else out there around 2008 when he was working on this. There were lots of books that were available in places like Waterstones, which you could take off the shelf and learn how to do some Python. But they weren't really aimed at humanities research. They certainly weren't aimed at historical research. So Turkell decided to write it, and he did that as a series of blog posts, which took historians or humanities scholars step by step through examples which not only taught them skills like programming, but also how it could help them to do the types of things that they needed to know how to do to be the historians of the day or the historians of the future. And he called this project Programming Historian, and he released it on the web. Now, it just so happened I was in his class at the time, studying my master's degree, and I used the site to teach myself a little bit of coding in Python. And a few years later, I suggested to him that we expand this blog that he had written and open it up as a peer-reviewed publication where people could submit their own research methods, and we could share those more widely via the web. He said, sure, so we launched this as a journal, and we called these individual blog posts, we called them tutorials, and we licensed everything under a Creative Commons by license to encourage people to repurpose the materials. Now, fast forward a little more than a decade, and Programming Historian is now an open access publisher, which is operating in 4 languages. So we've got English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. It's a formally registered charity. I happen to now be the chair of the organization. We've got a small staff. We've got lots of volunteers. We get well over 1 million readers per year from all around the world. And expanding on Turkell's original lessons, we've now published more than 180 of these tutorials, which cover topics ranging from augmented reality to building databases, analyzing texts, or building an API for sharing data programmatically over the web. So things that are very digitally focused, technologically focused, but of relevance to historians in their many shapes and forms. We're quite pleased with how this has all gone, and the example I've got on the screen there on the right-hand side gives you kind of a sense of what we have. So we explain the problem, the research problem that you might be facing, give you some idea of what you'll need to do to be able to solve it, give you some options, and then take you step by step through in a format that you could do on your own or could be done in a more formal teaching setting, depending on what's available to you. And because this material was not available in most curriculums, these tutorials enable people, no matter where they're studying in the world, to teach themselves some skills that might be useful to them. Now, for our purposes here today, the really interesting thing, I think, happened in 2016, because that's when we got an email from Mexico, from Professor Victor Gayol. He wanted to tell us that he had translated some of the Python lessons written by Turkell. He translated them into Spanish and posted them on his website. Now, Professor Gayol is an established historian of law in Mexico, and he was bilingual, so he was able to read these materials and learn from them in English, but he wanted his students to be able to learn from them as well, and a number of his students only speak Spanish. So he spent some time translating them, which was fine and was great from our perspective, because we had released them under a Creative Commons license to encourage exactly that type of thing. But this kicked off some conversations for us in our team. We just had a small team of volunteers at the time, and it had never really occurred to us that anybody outside of our little English-speaking bubble would be interested in what we were doing. So after some reflection, we decided to expand the project team, and we brought in a number of Spanish scholars to take charge of a Spanish version of the project. And I've got their names and their faces there on the screen. This began a journey for us as a project which has since expanded into French and Portuguese as well, and we hope to continue to be able to expand into other languages as we have time and resources. Now, this multilingual journey has taught us a few things that I wanted to share with you today. First, at least originally, this Spanish version of the project, we had envisioned it as a translation of the English method tutorials. So we felt we had some really great learning materials. They had learners that couldn't access those because of language barriers. And in order to give them meaningful access, we needed to translate that content. But those new Spanish colleagues had better ideas, and they also had local knowledge about what their students actually needed from us. See, the tutorials that we have are all written using real historical materials. So you don't just learn how to code, you learn how to code using real 18th century criminal trial accounts or 19th century political pamphlets. And naturally, all of the sources that we had originally chosen were in English. And it's not really feasible to translate an entire body of materials into Spanish just so that they can use the tutorial in a meaningful way. Some of these are huge collections of materials. So the Spanish team decided instead to localize the lessons. And when they felt it was appropriate, they would swap out the English 18th century criminal trial accounts for something that was original in Spanish, an original Spanish source. When they felt it was needed, they added additional context or additional steps to the tutorials, or links to Spanish language scholarships using a particular method or Spanish language documentation if it existed. And this would help the reader, the Spanish reader, to build up a deeper understanding not only of the methods, but also of the wider learning ecosystem that could support their further learning. For us on the English-speaking team, this was a chance to become aware that ideas written in English by and for people in wealthy countries in the West in particular meant that our ideas couldn't just be translated and made directly immediately useful to someone, for example, in post-colonial Latin America. So they had to be localized or refined for local use, which we learned was best done by a local expert. Secondly, like most websites these days, we keep track of web traffic. And the Spanish language publication has seen some really great growth over the years. And in the first few years that it was online, particularly in South America, the number of visitors was rising by more than 1,000% per year. But we dug a little bit deeper into the visitor stats on individual tutorials, which each focus on a particular method. And when we did that, we started to notice that certain research methods were popular in Colombia, but they weren't necessarily the same ones that were popular, for example, in Spain. And one lesson in particular really kind of stood out for us, and this was a lesson on how to use linked open data. Now, if you're not familiar with linked open data, this is an idea that gained quite a bit of traction a few years ago in the cultural heritage sector. The idea behind it is that organizations who own data, and it doesn't matter what kind of data that is, so it could be the weather forecast for tomorrow, or it could be all of the museum catalog information for something like the Rosetta Stone, which is in the British Museum. So anybody who owns that type of data, they should provide consistent, well-formed, open access to the data via the web so that other people can start to build connections between material. So for example, with linked open data, you might create a federated search box that could let you explore all of the materials in all of the world's museums. Or perhaps you could create a map that would map the original origin of all of the items in all those museums. So you're bringing together information and creating something new with it, and there's a big kind of push for working together here, or adopting shared standards to make data interoperable. And this was a really big conversation in Europe over the past decade, and that's exactly what our traffic statistics showed as well. So the lesson used material from a European museum as the sample data learning materials, and it was really popular in Spain, but it was completely untouched, or almost completely untouched in Latin America. It would seem nobody in Latin America was interested in linked open data. So we talked to our Spanish team about this, and our colleague who is based in Colombia, Maria Jose, knew right away what was going on. And she pointed out to us that linked open data wasn't really a big conversation in Latin America at that time because the priorities were in other areas, such as preserving the materials in their libraries and archives to make sure it doesn't disintegrate altogether. And of course this makes sense, that different regions would have different focuses for their cultural heritage agendas, and that we aren't all moving in the same direction at the same time. Now we've dug a little bit deeper into these regional variations of traffic patterns, and we noticed similar things around working with machine-readable text at scale, so analyzing large bodies of text. And a lot of our original English lessons focused on this type of task because of the nature of when the project came out and the types of things that people in the English-speaking West were interested in at the time. And what we didn't really realize at the time is that that type of work was actually predicated on 10 years of mass digitization of historical materials, which was really, really important from about 1998 to 2008, and particularly in countries like here in the UK or Canada and the United States. And we have billions and billions of records being digitized and put up online. And this is giving historians like me this opportunity to get excited and start trying to find ways to analyze this stuff. But Maria Jose in Colombia pointed out that that process never took place in South America. They never had this mass digitization phase. So historians of Colombia didn't have the materials to data mine, or at least not materials about themselves. And it was worse than that, she told me, because as a former Spanish colony, much of the historical materials Colombians might have wanted to data mine was owned by the Spanish state and sat in an archive in Spain. So that means that Colombians didn't even have the legal means to force Spain to give them access to this material, let alone spend the money and the time and the resources digitizing it so that Colombians could take advantage of these research opportunities. And of course, when it comes to the way taxes work, you can expect the Spanish taxpayers to expect their government to do things that are of interest to Spain before they use those resources for countries like Colombia. Now, we don't have that problem here in the UK because, of course, the British Empire means that all of the materials or a lot of the materials for a lot of the rest of the world are actually here and are controlled by the British state. So we are the ones that get to decide often what gets made into a format that can then be data mined. So where you are has a big impact on what types of research methods you might be interested in. So instead of the Spanish version of programming historian acting as a translation of methods developed in the English-speaking West, it's become something more than that. And it does translate lessons that the editors think that they're going to be valuable for their audience, but it also solicits lessons, new lessons, written by and for Spanish speakers who are operating in various places around the Spanish-speaking world. Nearly a fifth now of the Spanish lessons are Spanish originals, and they fill research methods gaps that English authors and editors didn't necessarily think were important enough to write about. One of the things that they focus on quite a lot is on digital mapping skills, which the English editors haven't focused on nearly so much. And Maria Jose pointed out that that's largely because even though they didn't own the materials, the Spanish state owns the materials, they do own the land. So a lot of historians and humanities scholars in Colombia focus on mapping as a way of building knowledge. So in short, really what they're doing is they are creating the types of materials that are useful for them, just like William Turkell back in Canada 12 years ago was creating materials that were useful for his students and colleagues in the time and place that he was operating in. And I think that's been our biggest success story so far at Programming Historian, because we have created a space where local people can set their own agenda and we provide the infrastructure for them to do so, but we don't tell them what's going to be an important research method for their local context. And I think for us that's been a process of recognizing that those of us who are based in places like London or Washington or Western centers aren't always the ones who are best placed to set the global research agenda. So that's led to a shift in the role of our original team members who launched that project a decade ago. We brought in a new team of people to lead our English language publication, and then people, including myself, have moved more into a curatorial role where we help keep that community supported. So I do things like raise money and raise awareness about the project so that we can support the ongoing maintenance of these lessons, so that we can encourage people in Latin America and different places around the world to share their own research methods with their colleagues. And we try to stay away from telling people what methods are going to be the important ones for them. So our role has really become creating the community rather than creating the lessons and the methods that we think people might need to learn. So that's my big take-home message for today, really, which is if you're used to being the one that has the idea for what the method is, if you are working across cultural boundaries, what we've really learned is that bringing on partners who know the local realities and the local needs is really a valuable approach. And that's something that I've been hearing throughout the day as well. So that's all I wanted to share with you today, but thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. I'd just like to invite Dr. Knox and Dr. Crymble to